You're watching The China Show. We are bringing you live pictures from Bondi Beach in Sydney, where tributes are pouring in as the nation mourns the victims of Australia's worst terrorist attack.
At least 16 people were killed. Mass shooting, of course, which took place on Sunday. You had two gunmen, a father and a son, open fire on a crowd celebrating the first day of Hanukkah in the park next to the beach. Now, we've heard since the tragedy and since the incident on Sunday out of the Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese calling it a targeted attack on the Jewish community.
What we saw yesterday was an act of pure evil, an act of anti-Semitism, an act of terrorism on our shores in an iconic Australian location, Bondi Beach, that is associated with joy, associated with families gathering, associated with celebrations. And it is forever tarnished by what has occurred last evening.
ABC News reporter Isabel Rowe is joining us from the ground right now. Isabel, thank you for taking the time to join us. If you could get our viewers just up to speed on what's taking place as we speak.
Sure. So where I am right now is in Campsie, which is in inner western Sydney. It's the opposite side of Sydney city to the beach where this unfolded yesterday. The reason why we're here is because this is the place where the two gunmen who opened fire on that group of Jewish people celebrating Hanukkah yesterday have been staying. It is a short-term rental accommodation. And we understand that the father and son who were living in Bondi, a far western suburb of Sydney, at some point came to this house to plan their attack. There has been police that have raided this house overnight. They have seized a number of items. We know that the father of those two gunmen was killed yesterday. He had 6 firearms. He was licensed to have them. His son, a 24-year-old man, was not killed, but he is in a critical condition in hospital, having been injured in that shootout yesterday. So police remain at this scene in Campsie here, and of course there are police at a second scene, that house in Bondi in Sydney's far west, and at Bondi Beach where this unfolded yesterday.
Isabel, you don't hear this quite often in Australia, right? This brings us back to one of the most fatal mass shootings that we've seen since what happened in Port Arthur in Tasmania in 1996. And it was after that tragedy that led to some sweeping gun control measures in Australia. Can you just let our viewers know just how rare an event like this is in Australia?
We are extraordinarily lucky to not see things like this. As you say, our last mass shooting of this scale was an incredibly long time ago. The Prime Minister at the time, John Howard, made sweeping changes to gun laws at the time. Now, Australia, as a result, does not see mass shootings in the way that countries like the US, for example, do. This is something that was seen by hundreds of people at Bondi yesterday. We've seen pictures of people running from the scene. They heard gunshots. They jumped out of the water. I had friends who hid in the bathrooms of restaurants. It's just something that Australians do not have to deal with. We don't see people even walking around with guns in this country. So to have two men with large guns standing and shooting at a busy beach is just unheard of.
Isabel, do we know how the two were able to come across the firearms? What do we know at this point about that?
At this stage, that is under investigation. What we do know is that this father and son, as I said, one of them was licensed gun owners. We also know that ASIO, Australia's security agency, had investigated the son 6 years ago for links to an Australian-based Islamic terror cell. So that is information that the ABC has been able to confirm this morning. No doubt inquiries are continuing as to why these men did what they did, what their motive is. As we say, one of the men was killed yesterday. The other man was shot, but in a critical condition in hospital. But police are going through their belongings both at their house and at this scene in Campsie here to try and determine more about their motive.
Isabel, thank you so much. Isabel Rowe there, our ABC News reporter, joining us with the latest there out of Sydney. And as Isabel just mentioned, right, this was what the government is calling an act of terrorism that was targeting a Jewish community. And certainly, there are a lot of calls now from the likes of Israel, right? We heard from the Prime Minister Netanyahu calling out Australia, saying they failed to protect Jews despite the warnings. Let's take a listen.
It pours fuel on the anti-Semitic fire. It encourages the Jew hatred now stalking your streets. Anti-Semitism is a cancer. It spreads when leaders stay silent and you must replace weakness with action.
Let's get more perspective now from our economy and government editor, Michael Heath. He joins us from Sydney. Michael, obviously this incident brings about a lot of questions about not just gun control, but also immigration and really Australia's relationship with Israel. How is the government responding to this?
Yvonne, I mean, Australia has had a really close, really long relationship with Israel. The ruling Labor Party now was one of the sponsors in the UN for the recognition of Israel, in the late 40s. So they're quite strong remarks and bordering on inflammatory, really, by Prime Minister Netanyahu, but at the same time, totally understandable as well. I mean, this is just a horrific event. At this stage, the government isn't responding. The Prime Minister was asked about it. He said, look, this is a time of trying to pull the country together and wrap our arms around the Jewish community. He didn't want to answer. And the opposition leader was asked as well, and she similarly voiced similar sentiments and had expressed her support for the Prime Minister. So they're sort of playing it down, and it's quite a complicated one because there's the two lines. The one thing about Israel and situation with Gaza and recognition of a Palestinian state, and the other this anti-Semitism that's been brewing and growing, following the attacks and following Israel's response as well. And now it is completely conflated. And so it's sort of a complicated position. But I think what we're likely to see is some pretty significant measures from Australia now to crack down on any sort of hate speech, anti-Semitism. There are recommendations out there, and I'd be very surprised if there's not a lot that's done there.
Michael, David here, what do we know, if at all, about the warnings that we've heard from the Israeli side that they have flagged some of these things to the Australian government? And obviously there will be a time and place too. And as you point out, there hasn't been yet a response directly to some of the comments coming through on the Israeli side. But specifically on the warnings themselves, is there anything we know about those?
Yeah, David, look, there's not a lot of information on it. Obviously, all intelligence agencies, Western ones, do work together. And we saw in 2024, we saw a sort of a round of incidents, and people, no one was injured or killed, but we saw, arson at Jewish shops and at a synagogue. We saw quite a lot of graffiti and, anti-Semitic graffiti and this sort of thing. And there was just this build-up of events that had been going on. In terms of the warnings they got, it's unclear. What was very interesting, though, was that in August, the government said that a couple of those incidents had actually been directed by Iran, the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. And Iran's ambassador was expelled over that. And what Iran had done is basically hired, according to the evidence the government had, was they'd hired criminal groups to stage some of these attacks. So it's very unclear, how much of this is outside influence, how much of it is domestic. The security agencies have said that anti-Semitism is their top priority, as I think you might have heard earlier. But again, there's a lot of moving parts here, and as you said, the investigation really, the police are even saying, look, we don't want to speculate until we've got something a bit firmer to tell everybody.
Michael, thank you. Michael Heath there, joining us out of Sydney with the latest. And we're also following, of course, developments from a mass shooting in the U.S. over the weekend at Brown University. Police have detained a person of interest after the shooting at Brown that left 2 dead and 9 injured. The school has sent students home and called off final exams, classes, and assignments for the semester. The shooting happened in a classroom on what was the second day of final exams at the Rhode Island University, which is about 11,000 students.
And for our Bloomberg subscribers, you can turn to your terminal for more information, get you up to speed on the shooting. This one specifically on Australia taking place. TLIV Go is a function that you run. We have all the information there, plus the latest context, latest commentary from multiple angles. Also some, obviously, the more important context to what's going on. This is Bloomberg. Let's have a look at market action as we kick off this trading week. About 16 or so minutes to the opening bell. And it's a down arrow story just about across the board to varying degrees. Kospi is coming off lows even at these levels, 1.5%. We opened, in fact, quite a gap lower on the Kospi at the open. We were down as much as 2.5 at one point. 1.3% on the Nikkei 225. Asia Pacific, as you can see, 0.6%. Right. On the dollar story, it's really just to keep in mind, we're coming off 3 straight weeks of dollar weakness already. We are seeing somewhat of a bounce. We should be getting the renminbi fixer today at any point over the next, let's call it 2 minutes or so. We'll bring you that. We'll bring you the information once we have that actual fix. The reason I frame it that way is, obviously, we've had a very strong Chinese currency of late, and we've seen signs of somewhat of a sort of pullback when it comes to these fixes. More on that in a moment. But yeah, dollar China coming up on your screens, as with the futures going into the open today. 10-year yield in China, 185. And just to also mention, we are going to get some information on the economy in about, let's call it 45 minutes.
Yeah, that data dump is happening at the top of the next hour. And certainly there is going to be some questions about how much this kind of slowdown that we're seeing in the fourth quarter is going to continue to show in this set of data here as well. In terms of your agenda, of course, the data dump is front and center, but then we also are focusing some sectors like chips as well. We have this Bloomberg scoop about giving more incentive, of course, to the chip sector in China. Autos as well. Regulators kind of coming through with some pretty harsh language here in terms of how to rein in the price wars there in that industry, and still dealing with the property side, given the news on China, Vanke last week, failing to get enough support from bondholders. Now Vanke is saying to improve initiatives, according to that filing to the Hong Kong Exchange this morning. There is that verdict with Jimmy Lai. Maybe that could happen as early as next hour. So we have our Min Low there on the ground. There is going to be a John Lee briefing in Beijing here today. We're still in the window for that FDI data out of China as well.
Yeah, and that should be, so we get the activity numbers, the FDI, and that should complete the set really as far as economic numbers goes. But, we'll take things one at a time, and we'll obviously focus in on the activity numbers coming through. And I guess more on the sort of specific policy incentives along the sector levels, because these will really be the things to track going into the open today, right? So we talked about property chips, as much as 70 billion in incentives there. I also want to zero in on the auto price wars, right? Because it's really been an area where we've had a ton of price wars. We've seen the number one BYD, for example, in the market really get pulled down as a result of that. So the strongest language yet, as Yvonne is pointing out here, so there are the market regulator has released new draft guidelines to stop automakers from pricing models too cheaply. Now, we are, of course, still in the early stages of this ongoing exercise, but it is a very strong signal in perhaps the right direction if you want to eventually have the light at the end of the tunnel of this competitive environment we're seeing in the auto space.
Yeah, let's bring in Chetan, Seth, APAC equity strategist at Nomura, to kind of tell us a little bit more about kind of the outlook for 2026. Let's focus a little bit more on China first, Chetan, just given the fact that we continue to see this market, this dichotomy between the weak macro fundamentals and still this, this equity market that still has some tailwinds if you take a look at the AI trade and the like. Are we likely to continue to see that gap between the economy and markets?
Actually, our view is that I think in the next few months, you'll probably see the gap in the fundamentals and the market price action to actually narrow. So if you just step back and look at last, let's say, 6 months, the equity markets had a terrific run, even though macro and micro corporate earnings were somewhat weak. But I think looking forward, you'll see a big focus from market participants on fundamentals. And as far as fundamentals are concerned, I think macro is still quite challenging. We'll probably get some support. Maybe we'll have to wait until March, April, spring. And corporate earnings are still quite weak. But there's no near immediate catalyst for China stocks. So I think there'll be a lot of focus on fundamentals.
Right. And so I guess the question there, Chetan, is in the meantime, while we wait for clarity on the cyclical side of things, how do you think the index trades? Let's call it the next 3 to 6 months.
Well, globally, we generally have a constructive backdrop for stocks. I think in that context, China might just do in line with global markets. For the full year 26, we are expecting around 10% upside on MSCI China. So our target for N26 is 93. Okay. So generally our view is that I think corporate earnings will continue to be on the weaker side. We are actually expecting earnings revision to stay negative. As far as valuations are concerned, we are expecting some bit of moderation in multiples. So if you tie these two things together, the index will probably move in line with earnings. So the good news about China is that 25 was a year when earnings base was quite low. I think index earnings was around 2.5% earnings growth rate for 25. Next year, consensus looking around 14-15% earnings growth rate. We are below consensus. So basically, the upside will be driven by earnings. I think that's how we are thinking about China equities in 26.
Two sectors come to mind when we talk about the soft macro. So we talked about automakers. The other one would be deliveries, platforms more generally. And I wonder what your outlook is for both. And are those two things a macro play, or is there something we just talked about, something the government can do to stop them from just cutting prices? And it's not a macro play, obviously, completely, but how do you look at the dynamics for those two sectors?
Actually, those two sectors are quite important. So one of the reasons why we are a bit, I guess, cautious on earnings is that both these sectors are facing a lot of competition, right? Involution is an issue for these sectors. If you look at China's corporate earnings, the big index stocks, whether it's the food delivery companies or even the automotive companies, they continue to see earnings downward. Even a stock like Alibaba, which is obviously a fantastic play for the AI thematic, is still seeing earnings downgrades because the traditional e-commerce business is still struggling because of competition. So I think the outlook of these two sectors is quite important. And I think just before I started talking, I think you were talking about the regulators potentially putting out regulations asking for these companies to actually go slow on some of these pricing. Now, if that thing were to materialize, I think it'll be fantastic news for the sector. But it remains to be seen whether we'll see some sort of anti-involution also coming for these two sectors. Let's say if that materializes, I think it'll be an upside risk for earnings.
Okay. The AI trade certainly has been in question globally. I'm just wondering, in China, do you see any signs of any sort of bubble-like territory at all at this point?
No, not really. Our view is that I think the fundamentals for the AI tech sector is still quite constructive. That's our house view. One of the things about AI as a thematic is that supply is still constrained, and so long as supply is constrained, we don't think that there are bubble concerns. So I think you could apply the same logic to China as well. The thing is that even if US AI thematic were to roll over, the thing with Chinese companies is that they are still geared or levered to the domestic China growth story, where I think the push for capex, in my view, will continue. So our view is that there's no bubble. Can we get towards a bubble level? We can. But I think that's one area investors should be focused on. And there are many companies in China that one could potentially play for as far as the AI thematic is concerned.
Chetan, stick around. more to discuss there in terms of the broader outlook for the region. Chetan Seth will be joining us in a couple of minutes. He's with Nomura there, of course. We're just getting the latest lines here coming through out of Australia. Yvonne, what are you looking at here?
Yeah, so we're hearing from the New South Wales Police Commissioner. He's speaking at this briefing here this morning and talking a little bit more about this terrorist attack. And he says the 24-year-old in hospital may face criminal charges. This is, of course, from what has been reported, the father and son that were involved in this shooting. So the 24-year-old remains in the hospital and may face criminal charges, according to the police department. But that is the latest coming through. We'll bring you more coming up. This is Bloomberg. Your pre-market in Hong Kong just opening up here. Already seeing 1% declines in the Hang Seng here today. It could be largely driven to what we're seeing in Vanke here. So we're down another 5.5% for the property developer. And this is, of course, after failing to get enough support from bondholders for that bond payment extension. So that is leading some of these property names lower here this morning. The company has talked about improving initiatives. They're studying improved initiatives after, of course, that failed support. Obtaining that support there. So that's the latest when it comes to the property side of things. New home prices, mind you, also come in about 5 minutes' time. And we're also focusing on the auto sector, Dave, just given some of the tough regulations that we heard over the weekend.
Yeah, the strongest language yet that they are, let's call it, upping the ante on anti-involution there. So, the headline here is plans around tougher regulations targeting the price war. Now, specifically what that means is new rules are perhaps being mulled, and there are public discussions, I believe, here in terms of the consultation period on what that might mean. So price compliance requirements for vehicle and parts production to sales practices. Automakers will face significant legal risks if they set sale prices below production costs. So there might be a limit to which they can cut prices.
Yeah, there's a good story on the terminal that talks about what's going on in Thailand, where you actually are seeing that price competition quite pronounced from some of these Chinese automakers, where they're trying to get rid of inventory by having slashing prices at some point, even lower than production costs and the like. So that certainly is one focus in this market here today. Of course, we're still waiting for that data dump that's happening in about 34 minutes or so here. We have, of course, Morgan Stanley's Xing to come through to digest and help us kind of see through the signals there as well. But here are some of the estimates that we're still expecting a bit of a slowdown there when it comes to the consumption side of things. This is Bloomberg.
Okay, we'll take you straight back here. So there is one ongoing press briefing taking place out of New South Wales specifically, and I'll mention that the Prime Minister is also set to hold a press briefing. It's unclear whether it's the same in about 15 minutes from now. Let's go back to the here and now, though. What we've heard so far there is from the police a few minutes back that a 24-year-old in the hospital may face criminal charges, and that we're also hearing from the Premier of New South Wales speaking at the briefing. One comment that's come through so far, it might be time to change the gun laws. That's no context still, given that, no specifics, but just to bring that to your attention. So in about 15 minutes from now, we are set to hear from the Aussie Prime Minister in 12:45 local time. That's, of course, in Sydney. That's 9:45 if you're watching out of Hong Kong, Beijing, and Singapore.
Yeah, we will continue to, of course, this coverage here when it comes to this tragedy. We'll have to take a step back, of course, and focus on what's been going on right now, which is that market open in China. So CSI 300 is still under a bit of pressure here today. We're down about 0.6% for Shanghai Composite as well as a CSI 300. Interesting enough, you're seeing copper prices actually coming off, given the record run that we've seen for the metal. We're down about 1.5% here this morning. And we're watching, of course, the chip plays, right? So Capricorn is down about 1.5% or more. Interesting enough, there was a good story about, this the incentives that they're giving to some of these domestic chip players, which may actually influence some of these stocks here today, but you're not quite seeing that for Capricorn. Could be just kind of following the sort of downtrend that we're seeing among some of the chip plays, AI plays globally and regionally here today as well. You take a look at how the Hong Kong Open is looking like today. Of course, as we count down to the new home price data that just came through here. Dave, maybe we should break that first before we even get to even the market open.
Yes, I'm just looking at the numbers now just so I can give proper context to this, right? So let's start with new home prices. Month and month, we're down, let's call it 0.4%. So not as big a drop as the one we saw back in October, which was closer to about 0.5%. Now, keep in mind, of course, this is across a very long list of cities. It's an aggregate number. It's a month and month. It's also new home sales. So it's perhaps not as indicative as what's happening more granularly, city to city. But that is just to say it does look slightly better looking at how you compare this current drop to the drop that we had back in October. Now, used home prices are down by as much as what we had in October. Month and month, let's call it 0.7%, 0.6%. So all things equal, maybe slightly better, but again, the broader view here is if you take a step back, it's really still continuous declines in the housing market, which I now believe are stretching well over 2 years now in terms of month-on-month drop in prices there.
Yep, and of course we'll continue to track what happens with Vanke. The property developer is planning to hold a second bondholder meeting on Thursday, and that's after it failed to obtain support for its plan to delay paying a $283 million note that was due on Monday. Let's bring in our China credit reporter, Trista Xing. She joins us now. What more can they do now?
Yeah, so I think Vanke will try to propose, improve the terms they previously proposed and try to present the new proposal and discuss the plans with bondholder on December 18th meeting and trying to win the support from bondholder because any proposed change need to win at least 90% of approval. So for the last, voting, they failed to win over 19% approval from any of those three proposals. So right now it's their latest effort trying to avert a default.
Yeah, and it's important to note that today is actually when December 15th is today, right? So
yes.
Today is actually when that bond was supposed to mature. Now, what is this second bondholder meeting that is in 3 days' time? Is it about the current bond or is this about the second bond at the end of this month?
It's about the current bond.
Okay.
Because that's the most urgent one they need to deal with, right? Because if they cannot, pay or cannot find another solution after the 5-day grace period, the bondholder can call default. So that's the urgent task they need to deal with at the moment.
Okay, we don't know anything else about the one that's later this month?
Not yet. They will hold another meeting for dealing with that one, but that's less urgent than the current one.
Okay, it's important context because we're talking about two separate bonds, and I think that's really important to distinguish that today is about the initial one that kicked things off with a story of late. Okay, Trista, thank you. Trista Law there, our China credit reporter. Let's have a look at what this week is going to be like as far as macro and economic numbers are concerned. So we start things off, of course, in the next hour. We have activity numbers coming through out of mainland China. We'll have more of that in a moment. As far as we have U.S. CPI coming out of the U.S., you have rate decisions in Southeast Asia, Thailand, and also Indonesia. And the one, of course, is the BOJ, the rate decision. We're counting down to that. You had the Tankan survey coming out, supportive really of if you think about it, a rate hike before we wrap up 2025. We'll be on top of the story there, of course, going into these major items on this agenda. Still with us for some final thoughts going into 2026, Chetan Seth, Asia-Pacific equity strategist at Nomura. Chetan, before we brought in the view on Asia-Pacific, just to close the loop on the greater China story, I noticed MSCI Hong Kong, you have an underweight there. Just help us understand that where sort of the Hong Kong cohort belongs in your universe.
So remember, MSCI Hong Kong is essentially the index of domestic Hong Kong stocks. It's utility companies, some property developers, Macau gaming stocks. So our general preference is China, MSCI China, which is, by the way, index of Hong Kong stocks as well as A-shares and some of these ADRs. Generally, our thought process on Hong Kong is that if you want to be in Hong Kong, MSCI Hong Kong, the best plays are either your exchange operators because of the ongoing strong liquidity in the stock market and also this ongoing impetus on capital market activity. So IPOs has been a hot theme in Hong Kong. And then you also have a few insurers which are part of the index, right? So I think that's how we are playing Hong Kong. And as you can see from our model portfolio, we have a couple of names there. But generally, our preference is, the domestic China-focused stocks, which are part of MSCI China.
You're also overweight in terms of allocations. Korea, you say the strong earnings growth story there, in India, as you quote here, the best diversifier against any risk of unwinding of crowded tech trades. Can you walk us through the thinking behind those two markets now?
Well, first of all, the thinking is that at least our view is that maybe first quarter, second quarter, I think the AI thematic trade will continue. Of course, we understand valuations and positioning is very stretched. And I think, if you just look at price action from Thursday, Friday, from the US markets, it seems like investors are really on the edge. You see one Bloomberg headline cross our terminals and NASDAQ crashes. So I think it just tells you that people are on the edge. And therefore, our key theme for 2026 is that of discipline and balance. So we think you should stay with the AI thematic plays, which you can find in Korea, parts of Taiwan, but at the same time, diversify your portfolios and have some laggards. For us, the biggest diversifier in portfolios would be India. This is a market which has underperformed in 25, but we think growth from here will see a cyclical recovery. Corporate earnings should also start stabilizing. We'll probably start seeing earnings start to get better. And then relative valuations of India in the regional context are quite attractive now. The market used to trade at almost 100% premium to AEJ. Now it's trading around 50-55%. So it's kind of mean reverted. So India we see as a diversifier in portfolios. Policy is clearly supportive. But Korea is your biggest AI leverage play in the region, strong earnings growth rate. And beyond AI, there are many other themes in the Korean market. One could find defense, electric transformers, K entertainment, K beauty. Many of these sectors will deliver high earnings growth rate in 26. So we do like Korea, and this is our key market, at least into the early part of 26.
Yeah, Chetan, if you could talk a little bit more about that, because the type of year Korea has had is statistical in aberration, right? So there's almost no playbook that will inform you how best to play not just the index, the rotation within that going into next year. It's something that's really new, like AI. So a very simple question for you. When you look at Korea, is there a rotation within that market that you think is appropriate, or do I continue to lean into the winners there?
Yeah. So look, this for 26, consensus right now is looking at 38% growth rate. Actually, if you look at our bottom-up numbers from Nomura analysts, we are even ahead of consensus. Even if we expect some sort of moderation in multiples, remember, multiples have to an extent already priced in this strong earnings recovery. I think the index will most likely grow into these earnings. And with that index means some of these memory companies will grow into these earnings. So I think we do like that space. Also, the other thing we have to remember is last year was horrible for Korea equities. I think we were down around 24% in dollar terms. So, part of those 80% gains we've seen year to date are coming off from just by way of mean reversion. So I think as long as earnings come through, we are right with our call that fundamentals will remain strong. I think Korea will remain quite an attractive market, at least in the first part of 26. But second half is much trickier, because our sense is that sometime in 26, I think there will be a rotation in the market. I think people will start looking at laggards. Now, it's very difficult to time and call it now. And that's why, our strategy is to have some underperformers or diversifiers in portfolio. So, for example, we picked India, and we've also picked Indonesia, by the way.
Tell us why. Indonesia.
Well, Indonesia's story is very simple. I've looked at markets for the last 10, 15 years, at least in the last few years, I've never seen so much negativity from both the sell side and the buy side of Indonesia. The currency was the second worst performer year to date. Indonesian MSCI Indonesia equities are the worst performing. It seems to me risk reward is quite attractive. The only challenge is there's no immediate near term catalyst, but maybe second quarter things can start looking better. Just like India, there has been a lot of policy support also in Indonesia. So we've seen BI cut rates. We've also seen injection of banking sector liquidity. And I think some of the earlier concerns around the sovereign wealth fund and the change in the finance minister, I think those concerns will also, in my view, start to dissipate in the next few weeks and months. And I think that will just create a better backdrop for Indonesian stocks. So I think risk reward for Indonesia is quite attractive, but I do acknowledge maybe immediate near term, there's no positive catalyst. So we have to be a bit patient on Indonesia.
Yeah, back to the India call, too. I mean, we're hearing a lot of your peers say that. This is sort of the diversifier play of the AI trade. What do you think is going to be what drives this equity market? Is it mostly going to be very domestic sort of plays in India?
Well, I think it will be just earnings. To be honest, multiples for India are still quite elevated. The India market is trading around 22 times MSCI India, so you can't say it's cheap. But earnings will be most likely double digit in 26. I think consensus around 15-16%. Even if you shave, let's say, 1-2 percentage points from that, you'll probably see 13-14% earnings growth rate for the market. You assume a little bit more moderation in multiples, I think you can get 10-11% price returns for India. But yeah, it's largely going to be domestic. The other thing we have to, I think one positive catalyst which could trigger a reallocation of flows into India is a potential trade deal between US and India. So one of the challenges for India equities and even India financial assets has been that there's no trade deal between US and India. So rupee is falling, foreign investors are continuing to sell India stocks. So if we do see some positive action there, I think it would just trigger a change in narrative and change in sentiment, and that potentially could be a positive catalyst for the equity market as well.
Chetan, final one on this year's been a really good one for equity markets if you just take a look at how most benchmarks have done. Going into next year, it seems we won't get the tailwinds coming through out of, let's call it, looser policy. It's looking like we're towards the end of the cutting cycle. I mean, it's 50-50 on the dollar when you look at some of these calls right now. What are your macro assumptions in terms of what the environment will be like for Asian equities next year?
So we are expecting global growth to be resilient. In fact, for US, our US team is calling for a slight acceleration in US GDP growth rate in 2026. So I think our number is 2.4% real GDP growth rate. We're also expecting Fed to cut rates. We are expecting 2 more rate cuts in the second half of next year. So rate cuts amid resilient US economy is not a bad outcome for stocks. As far as US-China relations are concerned, my base case is at least some relative stability, at least in the next few months, maybe before midterms, maybe things might change. So that's also not a bad backdrop. And in Asia, some of the laggard equity markets, so whether it's Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, India, the central banks in those countries will still cut rates. That's our view. I think North Asian central banks probably will not need to cut rates because growth is quite resilient. North Asia, basically Korea, Taiwan. I think China will probably deliver a rate cut sometime in 26. So I think policy in our part of this is still quite mixed. And that's not a bad outcome for stocks. I think the issue is just valuations. And in fact, in our assumptions, we are expecting some bit of moderation in multiples, but we are still expecting stocks to grind higher in line with strong earnings growth rate in 26.
Chetan, thank you so much. Chetan Seth, their Asia Pacific equity strategist at Nomura, joining us out of Singapore this morning. Just very quickly, before we take a very short break, our eyes are still on Vanke, the failed vote, of course, that took place there. So the equity, the 8 shares are down. We were down as much as 5-6%. We're a little off highs right now. It's the bond that's in question. The specific one, 3.98% yuan bond, has been halted because of these triggers, massive price plunge there. So I would assume this resumes trade in a couple of minutes once we get through that. More on that plus others in a moment. This is The China Show.
Former Hong Kong media mogul Jimmy Lai faces a verdict later on today in a landmark national security trial, a decision that will help define the limits of free speech here in the city. Let's bring in Min Lo, our China correspondent. She joins us now outside that court. Min, bring us up to speed on what's expected today.
Yeah, we're 10 minutes away from when that ruling will be handed down. Jimmy Lai is being charged with 2 counts of conspiracy to collude with foreign forces and 1 count of publishing seditious material. Now, if convicted, he could face up to life in prison. So we are expecting the verdict to be handed down in about 10 minutes time, but the sentencing could be handed down at a later date. And certainly over here where I am, there are many domestic and international media outlets. This case is being closely scrutinized as a test of the city's judicial independence, because Jimmy Lai's case is one of the highest profile cases that has been charged under the national security law so far. The trial has been presided over 3 judges handpicked by the chief executive John Lee. Jimmy Lai wasn't allowed to hire a British lawyer of his choice after Beijing intervened and gave the power to bar any such foreign lawyers to Chief Executive John Lee. And the Secretary of Justice also ordered this trial to be heard without a jury as well, citing the involvement of foreign forces. And international observers have been pointing to this case as an example of how Beijing is not fulfilling its pledge to allow the civil liberties of Hong Kong to remain unchanged for at least 50 years after the handover to Beijing in 1997.
Min, thank you. Min Lo there. She will bring us the latest once we have more information. Of course, once we have the verdict, the Jimmy Lai verdict, of course, speaking. Really more on this coming through here on Bloomberg Television. We'll be speaking with a fellow at the Center for Asian Law at Georgetown University. You can catch that interview coming up on Insight at the Times. Coming up, there we go, on your screens with Eric Lai, 12:30 p.m. if you're watching out of Hong Kong, Beijing, or Singapore. We'll leave you with a glance at markets. We'll take a short break. See you on the other side of it. This is Bloomberg. Right, welcome back. So in about just under 10 minutes, we should be getting the activity numbers for November. The estimates are in yellow on your screens. That's your benchmark for this specific set of numbers. We're coming off, of course, the white. Just to preface, of course, we're also just coming through. So this would almost complete the set of economic numbers. The credit numbers came out on Friday. We get this. We did get the housing price numbers, which were generally in line with estimates. In fact, slightly better on the month-on-month and new home prices. Better in a sense that they weren't falling as much as we saw in October. We'll see a bit of a pickup here going into industrial production, 5%. But still, of course, the property story continues to play out on a macro level. On a micro level, we talk about Vanke as perhaps the most indicative one, high profile of late. Jobless rate in line at 5.1%. Dollar China, of course, as a macro story, is one that is a stronger currency of late.
Yeah, it seems like there is going to be the same sort of tale, right, where you're seeing slower growth in consumption that's expected, maybe even a deeper decline when it comes to the whole investment side of things here, which is a key concern among a lot of the economists that we talk about, this collapse that we've been seeing when it comes to CapEx. Also, when it comes to industrial production, though, that might still be the bright spot, right?
Because the exports number.
Yeah, it really does show the resilience that we've been seeing when it comes to the export side of things here. But certainly that does lead to the more industrial overcapacity issue as well. So certainly there's going to be a lot to talk about with Robin Xing from Morgan Stanley. He's going to be coming on in just about 7 minutes' time to break down the data for us as well. In terms of what we're watching in markets here today, there is a bit of a sell-off when it comes to, of course, that whole AI trade. Risk assets are doing this in particular when it comes to the chips here. So even some of these domestic plays in China, which usually do actually benefit from any sort of global AI sell-off, is actually also falling as well here today. So, and that's despite that Bloomberg scoop about China said to prep about $70 billion for the chip sector incentives package as well. So you are seeing the likes of Huaheng Semi down some 4% today.
Yeah, and more threads, of course, which was the big listing of late, and it's still down. But I mean, when you compare that to the IPO price, it's certainly at much higher levels. We're also looking at auto stocks. So we have 2 stories on the Bloomberg today, and they are related in many ways. So China's bringing this EV price war to Thailand, dangling 38% discounts And what you have onshore is perhaps authorities not wanting to see what's happening there. So Chinese car maker stocks are in focus given the tougher regulations could be in the offing and as far as rules and legal ramifications for these automakers if they sell some of these prices below production price. Baby-related stocks are in focus as well, given the plans to expand the insurance program around birth insurance, things that cover more costs related to childbirth. So we'll see what happens here. And we are getting there, moving against the grain. And consumption stocks in focus are coming up on your screens, given all the policy pronouncements of late. There we go. We have more plans, more financial support. What does this all mean for the broader consumption story? We'll get more analysis, of course, in the next hour of the China Show.
Yep, so that data dump is going to be front and center in about 6 minutes' time. We're also focusing, of course, more with Morgan Stanley's chief China economist, Robin Xing, and bring you the latest when it comes to that Sydney shooting in Bondi Beach as well. You're watching The China Show. Welcome back to the China Show. Here's a look at the CSI 300. A half hour into the session, looks like we are basically regaining some momentum here, and now we've erased some of the losses from the last 30 minutes or so. So that ahead, of course, of that data dump in terms of the November activity data, that's set to be unveiled just moments from now. But the estimates are expecting for a further slowdown when it comes to the consumption side of things, also when it comes to investment, which continues to be on the decline. Industrial production might be that bright spot here today, just given what we've been seeing in terms of exports and the resilience around shipments and the like. So that certainly is going to be maybe one key focus here. But this on the back of what we saw in terms of the new home price data that came out about 30 minutes ago, still in contraction, but we are seeing maybe a narrower decline when it comes to new home prices. And here we go. That data just dumping on your terminal screens here this morning. And retail sales, this is a weak print, 1.3%. In terms of year on year. The estimate was for a 2.9% print, so that is quite a gap there in terms of the estimates and the actual numbers, and 4% for year-to-date numbers for retail sales. That's also softer than expected. Industrial production is still also weaker than expected, though, 4.8%. The estimate was for a 5% print here, 6% when it comes to year-to-date, which is in line. Fixed asset investment, there you go. We're seeing more contraction here, 2.6% in terms of fixed asset investment, a fall there. And that is a bigger fall than what we saw in the previous month as well. The jobless rate remains the same, 5.1%. We're watching, of course, the property investment side of things. That continues to be a very, very negative story. We're down 15.9% when it comes to property investment. So it seems like just from a glance, this is missing the median estimate of really what we've been expecting from economists there. So certainly that is, in some ways, there a bit of a disappointment. Let's bring in Robin Xing, chief China economist here at Morgan Stanley, to tell us a bit more about your takeaway from these numbers, Robin.
It's soft. Fourth quarter is tracking at probably in real term 4.5%, below the third quarter's 4.8%. But what matters more for investors is nominal GDP growth, which is tracking at a very subdued level of below 4%, given these numbers you mentioned. I think consumption is the biggest concern. Retail sales are slowing because the trade-in effects are diminishing, and also property is a big drag. Inventory is high, broader price declines, fragile confidence in property. However, you can see policy are in cruise control at this moment.
Yes. Why do you think there's a lack of urgency?
I would say for the full year, they achieved 5%. And from the CEWC, the work conference, the key message is to continue to focus on advanced manufacturing, on tech innovation. So it looks like for next year, that's the key message. There is a small nudge to domestic demand, but it's probably not enough.
So how are you looking at 2026 now? Is it going to be much challenging, given the fact that you say 5% is pretty attainable for 2025?
So we are running at 4.8% in real growth for 26 and 4.1% in nominal growth. That's our expectation. It's time, and again, it's below consensus on nominal GDP. So it's another year of slow burn for reflation in China.
Yeah.
And the reason is if you look at the policymakers, fiscal envelope is likely to remain flat versus 2025. I mean, of course, they may allocate a little bit more from that flat deficit to something like domestic demand, consumption, but it's still quite modest pace. And on property, the key message here is guardrails over bailouts, right? So far, all this evidence showed they are less interested in a big rescue plan, be it inventory purchase or nationalizing developers. More likely, if the stress deepens, they can provide a little bit subsidy on mortgages. All of these are showing for next year policy will remain reactive and small.
The consumption side is still, as you mentioned, I mean, that's quite a miss, right, for 1.3% for retail sales. There is some chatter, I guess, from the Work Economic Conference about optimizing the trade-in programs. What would that entail? Do you think that would mean Beijing is willing to increase funding or just kind of keep things from slowing down further?
Well, you are right. There is a lot of precautionary saving due to this incomplete social safety net in China. So to get consumption back on a firmer footing, they need three things. Cyclically, they can do trade-in programs, widening the coverage of category of goods.
Services.
Exactly. Probably some services vouchers. But meanwhile, they have to stabilize housing sector. So again, that subsidy on mortgage interest rates, which your colleagues reported about 3 weeks ago.
How effective would that be?
I think it's going to be a stabilizer. It's not going to reflating prices that much because it depends on the duration, the magnitude, and how they communicate this subsidy. But if they do it, at least it's going to make the cycle smoother, probably shortening the painful period of inventory digestion. But the last but not least, social welfare. We mentioned the incomplete social safety net. That's the key reason why consumers, even farmers, migrant workers are saving, not spending. So they have to provide that injection from central government budget to farmers and the migrant workers' social welfare accounts. So if they deliver all three things, I think it's going to anchor a reflation and a rebalance in China.
What about in terms of investment? You've written a lot about this, right? The declines that we've been seeing. What more do you think they can do to revive investment without really putting that fiscal burden on local governments?
In a more practical policy-making framework, I think they will use investment as the near-term anchor for growth. Consumption, well, they will definitely deliver a little bit more, but in near-term, Q1, Q2, they will front-load the local special bond issuance with a tilt into infrastructure like on-the-ground pipelines. They call it urban renewal programs, green capex, as well as AI data center. So I do think more public capex is probably the near-term anchor for policymakers to achieve the 5% target for next year. But over the medium term, they need to rebalance towards consumption. So again, it's back to all these tools we are expecting on the consumer side, be it services vouchers, this stabilization of housing sector, plus social welfare injection.
The consumption side, I mean, you're seeing regulators are a bit more, I guess you could say, harsher in terms of their, how these automakers, for example, are pricing their vehicles, right? We heard from the regulator over the weekend about, now there's going to be legal consequences if you price your cars below production cost and the like. But up until now, we really haven't seen some of these, car companies really adhere to this sort of anti-involution campaign. And we've seen that, right? Whether it's food delivery, autos, that continue to be quite weak. Should we expect any sort of change when it comes to anti-involution next year, beyond just what we see in the material side of things? I think that's where we're seeing most of the supply cuts and the like, but where else can we see that anti-involution campaign take effect?
Well, I think the deep-rooted reason for involution in China is there has been this supply-centric business model and policy framework over the last 2 decades. Too much focus on supply, production, investment, too little focus on consumption, services, and rewarding household well-being. Now that's changing, but in a very subtle way. So over the weekends, there are so many official media interpreting the CWC. And one of them mentioned they do want to invest more in people-first investment in social welfare, education, healthcare. And if they can boost the domestic demand with that kind of a social welfare reform, with enough demand, then you don't have to do all these cutthroating, price competition. So demand stimulus is the key here. You can't just do anti-evolution with some supply-side consolidation.
It seems like their approach, policymakers, is in terms of boosting spending, is really unlocking that household wealth, as you mentioned. So in their interpretation, it's not a lack of spending power. Do you agree with that sort of approach here, or is there really a need to really increase household wealth?
I think yes and no. The Chinese household is saving 35% of their income. That's like the highest saving rate globally. Yeah. And one of the reasons is the lack of a complete social safety net. Yeah. So covering migrant workers and farmers, poor people with social benefits. That's going to unlock some consumption potential. Yeah. But meanwhile, is it also because China is in so-called K-shaped recovery? K-shaped is so popular among describing global economy. I doubt, because the thing is, K-shaped means the cake is still growing, right? It's just that you didn't get a fair cut. But if you look at the nominal GDP growth in China, it's quite subdued. It's below 4%. So even the broader economy was not growing as it was, as it's supposed to be. So it's not just K-shaped. I think it is due to this very subdued nominal growth. They have to focus on lifting nominal growth by showing up consumers with social welfare reform, with some services vouchers, and stabilizing the housing sector. That's my New Year resolution. The three things: stabilizing housing sector with mortgage subsidy, providing broad-based vouchers for consumers on services sector, and also try to inject more social welfare benefits for farmers.
And should we expect the currency to stay strong too, in ways of boosting imports or even domestic demand in some ways?
I mean, that's the part I'm least worried about. The Chinese exports remain very competitive. Even with all these noises about geopolitics, EU or Mexico tariffs. We think that just make this supply chain longer, lengthier, rather than making it broken, because you can see rerouting, you can see the U.S. are importing more and more from other exporters, but these exporters are importing from China. These high value-added components and parts are all still from China. So we are less worried about China's exports. It's going to be the bright spot, but relying on advanced manufacturing and exports alone do not solve China's domestic deflation problem. So they still have to deliver the rebalance and the reflation at home.
Right. Robin, we'll be tracking, of course, your New Year's resolutions, of course, and your wish list for 2026. Robin Xing there, Morgan Stanley, Chief China Economist, joining us here on the shows. And, of course, subscribers can also turn to the terminal for more on, of course, these economic numbers. And they're already writing quite a bit, in particular when it comes to the retail sales growth. I think that was the biggest disappointment, the weakest print we've seen since COVID, while investment also slumped further as well. T-Live Go is where to go for your functions and, of course, latest updates. This is Bloomberg. A former Hong Kong media mogul, Jimmy Lai, faces a verdict in a landmark national security trial any time now. Let's bring in Min Lo, our China correspondent. She joins us live outside the court. We believe this verdict is being read out right now, Min.
That's right. Our colleague is inside the courtroom. We know that the judge, Esther To, had mentioned that there should be no disturbance in the courtroom. Anyone causing disturbance will be asked to leave. And the total verdict is about over 850 pages long. The judges are only going to read the concluding remarks. We're still waiting to hear more details. The verdict has not been confirmed yet, so we're waiting for that. But Jimmy Lai has been charged with 2 counts of conspiracy to collude with foreign forces and 1 count of publishing seditious material. If he is convicted of colluding with foreign forces, he could face up to life in prison. We expect the sentencing to be handed down on a separate day. And of course, this is being closely watched as a landmark national security trial, as a test of the city's judicial independence, given that Chief Executive John Lee had handpicked the 3 judges that are presiding over this trial that is being heard without a jury as well.
And Min, you Talk us a little bit more. You mentioned a little bit about the significance of this case. Potentially could be a barometer of freedom of speech, judicial independence in this city. Also, it is a test of really, China's diplomatic ties as well. What are Western governments and what are they saying about this trial?
Yeah, it's been closely watched, and of course, there has been strong reaction from the likes of the US and the UK. US President Donald Trump said that he raised this issue of Jimmy Lai's trial to President Xi when the two men met in South Korea in October. The UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer also said that this is a priority of his administration to make sure to secure Jimmy Lai's release. And one of the points that international organizations has been highlighting is his deteriorating health, because his family says that he suffers from heart palpitation, and international organizations are calling for Jimmy Lai to be released on medical grounds because he's been taken into custody since December of 2020. He's been in solitary confinement for close to 5 years now, and of course we'll be watching this very closely. And as you said, it's also a test of judicial independence because Jimmy Lai wasn't allowed to hire a British lawyer of his choice. Beijing had intervened and given Chief Executive John Lee the power to bar any foreign lawyers from this case. And the case is being heard without a jury as well. The authorities cited the involvement of foreign forces. Beijing so far has said that other countries should not be meddling in China's internal affairs and has said that the national security trial is fair. It treats everybody equally, and it shouldn't be something that other countries are intervening on.
Okay, can you walk us through a little bit more of the timeline that could be put forward here? Obviously, we're going to hear the verdict anytime soon and the results from that. What comes next after that we need to watch out for?
Yeah, so after this, we will be waiting for the sentencing, which will be given at a later date. And after that, it will really depends, right? Because we know that this case is in some ways potentially going to be part of the bargaining chip in broader US-China trade talks. And we know that Xi and President Trump are going to meet potentially in April of next year. And it will be interesting to see whether this would come up as part of sort of a bargaining chip in exchange for perhaps lower tariffs. And at some point later, after the verdict and the sentence has been handed down, whether or not Jimmy Lai will be able to get a suspended sentence on medical grounds. But just to give you a little bit more background about this case, after the imposition of the national security law back in June of 2020, Jimmy Lai was arrested in August, and he's being accused of calling for sanctions on Hong Kong and on China. And his foreign contacts is under scrutiny because Jimmy Lai met with then U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and then U.S. Vice President Mike Pence as well. And of course, he's the founder of Apple Daily, which is a pro-democracy newspaper that often urges its readers to take to the streets. And so prosecutors have been pointing to that, to his online broadcasts, to his articles as evidence of his intent to collude with foreign forces. Although as part of Jimmy Lai's defense, he said that yes, he called for sanctions, but before the imposition of the national security law and not after. And so that has been a case of a point of focus in this trial.
And this coming against some news that we heard in terms of the Hong Kong Democratic Party that dissolved after 3 decades of operations. Min, tell us a little bit more about that.
Yes, of course, this case is coming at a very delicate time for Hong Kong, right? It's gone through so many changes. After the imposition of the national security law, we have seen dozens of civil society groups being forced to shut down. And just over the weekend, the Democratic Party had voted to dissolve itself. This was mentioned by the former chairwoman Emily Lau on Facebook over the weekend. It's been a party that's been in operation since 1994. It's been a key opposition party that has been very outspoken in pushing Beijing aggressively for democratic reforms, in particular calling for universal suffrage. And so this marks the end of that political party, and we just concluded the Legislative Council election a week ago as well, with the second lowest turnout that Hong Kong has seen. And of course, this is coming as there has been a lot of reform to the electoral system, with the government mandating only patriots to run in the elections. And of course, we also just seen that fire, right? One of the most deadly fire that Hong Kong has experienced in decades, killing 160 people. And soon after that fire, authorities also warned individuals against using that fire as a pretext to incite chaos in Hong Kong. So certainly there has been a sense of caution in this courthouse. When I was trying to speak to supporters who queued here overnight to go into the courtroom, not many of them were willing to speak to the media.
Min, thank you. Our China correspondent Min Lo there. Of course, we'll be speaking with more on this and covering, of course, this trial with Jimmy Lai, with Georgetown Center for Asian Law, about the verdict and how that could impact press freedoms in Hong Kong. Eric Lai will be joining us there from Georgetown, and that's going to be happening on The Times on your screen. This is Bloomberg. Tokyo Gas, Japan's biggest distributor of fuel, plans to invest in U.S. downstream assets to lift earnings and reinforce the last leg of its energy supply chain. Speaking to Bloomberg, President and CEO Shinichi Sasayama says the investment will go towards developing and making the company's shale gas assets profitable.
We're currently investing mainly in shale gas projects in East Texas. Our priority for the next midterm period is to ensure solid revenue from these existing investments. As for whether we'll further increase our asset holdings, we will assess that carefully based on conditions. While ensuring solid returns from our upstream operations, we also want to invest in mid and downstream businesses to build out our portfolio. We've already made investments in midstream, downstream areas such as marketing and trading, and we intend to raise its profitability. For downstream, we're also considering opportunities in things like LNG liquefaction plants, export terminals, and the energy services sector.
I know that you've been reviewing buying potentially from the LNG project in Alaska. Where are you at in that evaluation?
Alaska has the advantage of being geographically close to Japan, and LNG can be shipped without passing through geopolitical choke points, which is a major benefit. However, pricing and other terms are still unclear, so further examination will be necessary.
When can we expect an announcement?
We only just signed a letter of intent expressing our interest. The pricing and other terms will eventually be presented by the other party. Since the next step depends on the other party's timing, it's difficult for me to say at this point when that will be.
Tokyo Gas maintains that Russian imports of gas are important for the energy supply of Japan, and yet we continue to see international pressure to stop these purchases. Will you need to reassess?
We don't see any urgent need at this point to review our position in the short term. Sakhalin gas continues to contribute to Japan's stable supply, so any final decision will be made in consultation with the Japanese government.
What sort of conversations are you having with the government on future purchases of Russian gas? And also, perhaps, can you tell us a little bit more about your diversification strategy as well?
We're not fully aware of any details to the discussions taking place within the Japanese government, but we understand that the government recognizes Sakhalin gas as an important energy source that contributes to Japan's stable supply. We have long pursued 3 pillars of diversification strategy in procurement: diversifying countries and projects, diversifying contract types by combining long and short-term deals and using different indices, and diversifying supply routes. Traditionally, our flows have been centered on the Asia-Pacific region, but we're now also looking to the Atlantic side to broaden our supply channels.
Tokyo Gas President and CEO President Shinichi Sasayama there speaking to Bloomberg's Sherry An. This is Bloomberg. All right, we're Before checking markets here this morning, just to recap, of course, that data dump that we got out of China where when it came to retail sales, it was the weakest print we've seen since the pandemic. It looks like when it comes to markets, they're kind of seeing through this sort of data here right now. Shanghai Composite in particular has been climbing back, and we are kind of slightly just flat here this morning. HS Tech also coming off some of the initial lows here, but we're still down about 1.5%. Hang Seng in particular, though, also lower by about 186 points or so. But certainly this sort of dichotomy, as we've been talking to Nomura about this, Chetan, Seth, saying that the gap we've seen between the economy and the macro versus the markets might actually start to narrow, but they're still seeing when it comes to CSI 300 or MSCI China, a 10% upside gain for next year here. Let's get back to one of our top stories this morning. At least 16 people were killed in the mass shooting on Sunday. 2 gunmen, a father and son, opened fire on a crowd celebrating the first day of Hanukkah in the park next to Bondi Beach. Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese called it a, quote, targeted attack on the Jewish community.
What we saw yesterday was an act of pure evil, an act of anti-Semitism, an act of terrorism on our shores in an iconic Australian location, Bondi Beach, that is associated with joy, associated with families gathering, associated with celebrations, and it is forever tarnished by what has occurred last evening.
ABC News reporter Isabel Rowe is now on the ground and joins us there with the latest. Isabel.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Can you tell us a bit more about what's happening now?
So I'm at a scene in the inner west of Sydney. It's a place where a father and son shooter duo were staying the past couple of days before they were unleashing that horror that we have seen at Bondi. The pair were staying here in a short-term rental. There were other people staying with them in other rooms. They have come back this morning to collect their belongings after this place was raided overnight. Neighbours say that they were yelling at the house for people to get out, and there were police choppers overhead. There is another scene in Sydney's far west, the family home of this father-son pair that has also been raided, and police remain there as well. And of course, the scene at Bondi Beach, one of utter devastation and sorrow, and remains cordoned off this morning.
Isabel, can you tell us just a little bit more about how everything kind of transpired, right? I think, over the weekend, I think there was so much cell phone video of people almost in real time just showing what exactly happened, even including a bystander who's now been hailed a hero for really stopping one of those shooters and snatching his rifle away from him during this sort of exchange. Tell us more about how all this unfolded.
It was extraordinary. You're right, there was so much video because Bondi Beach is such a popular spot, and in a hot Sunday afternoon that it was, there were a lot of people around. What happened was that people first started to hear gunshots and people started running from the scene. They didn't know what they were seeing or what they were hearing. It's a very unusual sound. You would almost never hear a gunshot in this country. What happened was that 2 men, this father and son, a 50-year-old and 24-year-old, had large rifles. They went to a pedestrian overpass that gave them some height, and they looked into a park just at the Bondi beach there. They were able to shoot at a Jewish celebration. It was the first day of Hanukkah. There were families and children there dancing and singing, eating together and celebrating. What unfolded was pure terror. The witnesses I spoke to said that they were shielding their children, the people were running, and then of course victims lay on the ground. People came in to help. Police and ambulance were there extremely quickly. And as you said, you can see in one of those videos, a bystander actually came up from behind to one of the gunmen, grabbed him around the shoulders, wrestled the gun away from him and pointed it at him. He didn't shoot. He then put the gun down next to a tree and put his hands up to make sure that police knew that he was not the shooter. But that man is being hailed a hero in this country for potentially saving a lot more lives.
And we just heard from the New South Wales Police, also the Premier there, talking a little bit more about, the need for maybe a change in gun laws now, Isabel, in light of this tragedy.
Yeah.
Tell us a bit more about the reforms that could come. I mean, what is the government and how are they responding to this incident now?
Well, Australia has particularly strict gun laws, and it has ever since the other mass shooting that we saw a long time ago in this country in '94. So the fact that this has happened has raised immediate questions. The father had 6 guns, but he was licensed to have them. He was a member of a gun club or a hunting club. His son, however, the 24-year-old, was known to ASIO. The ABC understands that he was investigated at least 6 years ago for his potential connection to a Sydney terror cell. So the questions now are about why the father of this man was able to have a gun licence and was able to have 6 of these rather large, long guns, and whether or not the laws can be changed to do anything about them. Now, the Premier, Chris Minns, as you said, has said that he will potentially call Parliament back to sit again. It's already finished for the year, but he said he will call the Parliament back if necessary to pass laws if there is something that he thinks need to be done that could have prevented something like this.
Isabel, thank you. Isabel Rowe there, ABC News reporter joining us out of Sydney here this morning. And for subscribers, you can also turn to your terminal for more on this story. T-Live Go is your function for the latest updates, plus commentary, of course, of this tragic event. That is also, of course, when it comes to the data dump that we got out of China, there is also one going on for that as well. This is Bloomberg. Bring you to live pictures out of Beijing. This is the National Bureau of Statistics, of course, having their monthly sort of press briefing here after that activity data released there. What was mostly a disappointing set of numbers here were all the softer side here, especially when it came to retail sales, which was the weakest print we've seen since COVID, a 1.3% print for November. We are hearing from the National Bureau of Statistics saying that China will continue to deepen policies to boost consumption and that household consumption confidence needs a further boost. What we've heard so far really has been, from the Work Economic Conference, there was the readout that suggests that maybe they could actually extend some of these trade-in programs for the consumption side of things, and what form certainly is still the key question. But we're also getting some breaking news when it comes to the Jimmy Lai trial as well. Let's flip to that. So it seems like the media mogul, Jimmy Lai, has been found guilty on seditious publications charge. He also has been found guilty when it comes to the collusion charges as well. So this is, of course, as we've been talking about, a very high-profile national security law case here in Hong Kong. And Jimmy Lai now confirmed by the verdict here that he has been found guilty when it comes to sedition as well as collusion. Now, the next step, of course, according to Min Lo, is, of course, the sentencing side of things here. There has been reports that he might face life in prison given these charges. So we'll continue to continue live to the scene. Let's bring in Min Lo with the latest. Min.
Yes, we just got the verdict, guilty of all charges. The sentencing will be announced on a separate day, but yes, the maximum sentence could be life in prison, and Jimmy Lai will have up to 28 days to appeal the verdict. And just now in the courtroom, the judges were reading through some of the WhatsApp messages between him and his assistant, pointing to how his assistant had helped to set up meetings between Jimmy Lai and some senior U.S. officials, and pointed to how there was indisputable evidence and said that he had harbored intent to collude with foreign forces and so on. It was a very long readout of the concluding remarks, and the total verdict is over 800 pages long, I believe, and that will be made online later on so we can pour through the details. But yes, this is, of course, the conclusion of a landmark trial, a marathon trial that lasted over 150 days. And it's a very high-profile case because Jimmy Lai is a household name in Hong Kong. Many people know him as the founder of Apple Daily, once a now-defunct newspaper that was very pro-democracy. It often urged readers to take to the streets. It is known for its tabloid-style coverage of politics and of celebrity news as well. And he was one of the first to be charged under the national security law. After it was imposed by Beijing back in June 2020, he was arrested and charged in August of that year.
We were talking about how Western governments have been watching this case, this marathon trial, as you've been reporting, Min, for more than 150 days or so. You know, what likely might occur from this verdict now? You know, obviously we heard from President Trump. He's talked about, according to some reports, vowed to save Lai. You know, is this likely going to raise more tensions abroad?
Yeah, certainly. I think we'll have to watch closely what is the international reaction after this, you know, whether there will be more sanctions from the likes of the US and UK on Chinese officials, for example. We know that already after the imposition of the national security law, Trump, who was then president had halted the preferential treatment for Hong Kong and sanctioned some officials that cracked down on rights. And certainly President Trump has said that he raised this issue again when he recently met with President Xi in South Korea in October. So this could come up once again, maybe when the two presidents meet next year, could be part of the bargaining chip. It will be interesting to see whether China would be willing to give Trump a win by suspending the sentence on medical grounds, for example, in exchange for some other concessions, perhaps on trade or tariffs. But certainly this is all speculation at this point. We'll have to see what the international reaction is. But the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer had also said that it is a priority of his administration to secure the release of Jimmy Lai, and many international organizations have been appealing on humanitarian grounds and on medical grounds to release Jimmy Lai given the deterioration of his health. His family members saying that he suffers from heart palpitation and his health has been deteriorating. He's looked visibly thinner over the years.
And we are getting some lines now in terms of the time frame here. The hearing for the mitigation of Jimmy Lai's case is set for January 12th. So that date has been set for the hearing for that. Min, you talk about his health. You talk about really the significance of this. This case has largely been seen as sort of a test case of this national security law when it comes to freedom of press, when it comes to judicial independence here in the city. You know, what's the message it's going to send really to the international community with this case?
I mean, it was a clear verdict from the judges, and obviously it is sending a message that China is not going to tolerate any form of, violation of the national security law, right? The sort of protests that we saw in 2019 and 2020. Obviously, here at this courthouse, you can see that around me there are many police officers just maintaining the security of this place, ensuring that there is no disturbances, no sort of large-scale gathering of people that could spiral out of control. And even when I was talking to some of the supporters who queued overnight to go into the courthouse, many of them were wearing masks or covering their faces with umbrellas, not very keen to show their face or speak to the media at all. And there's this sense of cautiousness that everybody is taking here, especially after Hong Kong suffered from that deadly fire as well. Soon after that fire, the National Security Office also warned people not to use that fire as a pretext to incite chaos in Hong Kong. So this city has seen a lot of changes. We have seen the closure of dozens of civil service groups. Of course, over the weekend as well, the Democratic Party also voted to dissolve itself. The former chairwoman, Emily Lau, announced that on Facebook, marking the end of an opposition party that has been operating since 1994, a party that has been very outspoken in pushing Beijing for democratic reforms and calling for universal suffrage in Hong Kong as well.
Thank you, Min Lo there, our China correspondent with the latest here. Of course, Jimmy Lai just confirmed, found guilty on all charges here on this national security case. We're going to switch gears to get to one of our top stories here. We're still awaiting that press briefing with the Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese after the nation's worst terrorist attack that killed at least 16 people. Joining us now is Greg Barton, research professor and chair of global Islamic politics at Deakin University. Professor, it's great to thank you so much for joining us on such unfortunate circumstances, of course, and thank you for your time. I wanted to get your take on what might have been the motive around this deadly shooting. It seems like these two shooters were targeting the Jewish community. There is a lot of concerns about, in the nation about whether the government did enough to stamp out this anti-Semitism in the country. What is your take on what really happened?
Good to be with you, Yvonne. This appears to be a lone actor attack. I say appears because the police are investigating whether this father and son duo were in communications with any cells or networks in Australia or abroad. But so far it appears that they acted alone. Police are treating it as a terrorism investigation that unlocks more resources for them, but there's good reasons for nominating this as a terrorist investigation. Clearly it was an attack targeting a Jewish Hanukkah family gathering on the beach, a sort of a very festive time, much like Christian Christmas gatherings. It's meant to be, Hanukkah is the festival of light. It's about light overcoming darkness. So this is a terrible tragedy to have come in this way. So anti-Semitism was clearly involved. But we know that police are reporting that Navid Akram, the younger of the two, the son, had been involved with an Islamic State cell in Sydney in 2019. Apparently there was no further contact. Police had him on their radar, but they didn't think he was likely to go into any action. So that's one of the things that will now be investigated. But if it's an Islamic State motivation, we understand that story pretty well. They're anti-Semitic, they're anti-everyone who's against them, and they believe in using horrendous violence to bring about a shock and a revulsion that brings about change. It's likely that this pair was prepared to die. They would have thought of themselves as being martyrs or heroes going from zero to hero. So there's a psychological factor in the motivation. But yeah, hatred of Jews, ugly stuff, the sort of extreme ideas of Islamic State, if that's what is guiding them, as appears to be the case, and then perhaps a desire to become somebody in their own mind.
In terms of the immigration side of things, I mean, Australia has been seen as one of the places that, a society that has, opened its door when it comes to migration. Do you see any sort of change on that front here in light of this tragedy?
I think some in politics, and not many, it must be said, will try and get some traction from this in an anti-immigrant way, as we're seeing in other parts of the world, not least the United States. But the reality is Australia has a very successful multicultural society. And with this incident, it's true we had a middle-aged Muslim man, happened to be a fruiterer, who became one of Australia's worst terrorists. But another figure we've heard about, Ahmed Al-Ahmad, another middle-aged Muslim Australian who also was a fruiterer, as it happens, passed by Bondi, didn't hesitate to get out and sneak up behind the younger gunman, tackle him, get his gun off him. He was shot by the father twice in response. Saved many lives, but also saved our sense of hope in a multicultural Australia, I believe. And we had another incident not that long ago in Bondi where, not terrorism, but a Muslim security guard, a young Afghan refugee, lost his life tackling the assailant. So it's a reminder to put things in the broader context.
And of course, we heard from the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu with some pretty harsh words, called out Australia for failing to really put an end to the sort of anti-Semitism in the country as well, and maybe showing weakness by recognizing Palestine as a state as well. What does this tell you about the future of Australia and Israel relations moving forward?
Well, they were difficult anyway, just because of the circumstances in Israel, and they're going to continue to be difficult. It's very, very tragic that so much work has been done over the decades to build relations with the State of Israel that have been unravelled so much in the last couple of years, in part because of the statements from the Netanyahu government that often seem to be at odds with reality. I think these statements will be seen in the same way. It's true that there is rising anti-Semitism. We've seen the terrible consequences of this with this attack, the worst terror attack on Australian soil. But it's also the case that Netanyahu is deeply self-interested and focused on domestic politics and his own circumstances. So it's not that people reject the fact that anti-Semitism is a problem. It's just that this criticism of Netanyahu doesn't seem to be genuinely guided by concern for what's happening in Australian society. It's more about him.
Is there, in terms of stopping this sort of anti-Semitism, what's needed from the government? What sort of legislation, or legislature is needed to really stamp out this sort of violence?
Australia has some of the most complete anti-terrorism legislation in the world. I think we can do more, though, when it comes to hate speech. We don't have proper ways of documenting hate incidents, whether it's anti-Semitic or otherwise. We can do more work in that space. I don't think any legislative fix is going to completely make us secure, but we need to do more work on tackling hate. And I think that the focus now needs to be the whole of society. We've had Muslim and Jewish leaders come out together and say we need to not allow this to be a turning point where hate turns in on us. We need to overcome it. The message of Hanukkah is, a light in the darkness, and that has to be our guiding principle going forward.
Greg, appreciate your time. Greg Barton, research professor and chair of global Islamic politics at Deakin University, joining us out of Melbourne. Or we'll leave you with live pictures out of Sydney, where a memorial is underway at Bondi Beach. This is Bloomberg. Just want to recap that China data that we got here at the top of the hour, and it was in most parts a miss on most fronts in terms of the median estimates here this morning. Retail sales perhaps is the bigger disappointment at just a 1.3% print. That is the weakest print we've seen since COVID. Industrial production also was a miss here. That's despite, of course, the resilience that we have seen from exports, but industrial production still seen as sort of the bright spot there. Fixed asset investments also continue to be in contraction at 2.6% down. We're hearing a little bit more into the lines here from the National Bureau of Statistics. I'm talking about this, the investment side of things, which is still heading for the first annual contraction since at least 1998. Well, policymakers are saying, China still has a lot of investment potential there when it comes to education, they say. But really what they're talking about is the slump in domestic demand as well. But they're also talking, though, in education and housing, there's still potential for investment there. In the next step, China needs to further stimulate private investment and allow government investments to play a better leading role there. So certainly they said a lot of that had to do with decreasing investments in real estate as well. Of course, the property side of things still on the weekend there. Markets are doing this here. Onshore looking a little bit better. That's it for us here on The China Show.